Oh my god, guys, it's finally happening. It's part 3. We can get this nightmare over with.
The Americas.
Alrighty, so before we do this, I want to say that this one will be a bit short. So the Pearl Islands south of and owned by Panama have few details about them, so take my estimations with a grain of salt, please. I think their land area is around 152 square miles, but that's completely a guess, so if you're going to use this stuff, do your own research. Their population I also couldn't find, but for my guess, it's around 2,000 people or so, give or take. Like I said, grain of salt. Archaeologists found artifacts there dating back from before Columbus, meaning that the native groups reached the islands a long time ago, hence why there was a native population when the Spanish arrived. Speaking of which, in 1513, the Spanish arrive, and they sail to the islands and explore around a bit, you know, the usual stuff. And only 2 years later, the islands and their natives, you know, the people on there, they kinda sorta die off. Like, a majority, nearly all of them. On the islands, the Spanish used them to harvest a great amount of pearls, hence their names. That should have been a given. The largest island of which is Isla del Rey, the big one on the right. It experienced a large amount of forced immigration from African slaves to harvest pearls and other resources on the islands under the Spanish. Other than that, the islands were later subject to pirate raids, and, I don't know, the Shah of Iran was sent there in the late 70s during his exile. The Panamanians weren't too happy about it. The islands have all sorts of exotic animals like iguanas, parrots, snakes, and crocodiles. Like I said, I don't like to rely on Wikipedia for everything, but there's like no other resources for this stuff that I feel comfortable using. I scoured a few different ways, but you know, I like my videos like I like my debates, full of facts and logic. But really though, I'm sorry, I do not like these short segments. I do not want to have to do this again. Hey, how you doing? So the California Channel Islands, as the name suggests, are owned by Murica. They measure in at around 908 square miles and sport a juicy 4,600 person population or so. They're located off the southwest coast of California, and there's 2 sets of them, a north group and a south group. They were first discovered 13,000 years ago, where the Native Americans would soon end up building little foraging settlements. The 2 main groups that settled the islands were the Chumash, who lived here and took the northern islands, and the Tongva, who lived here and took the southern islands. For the next 10,000 years, the Tongva and the Chumash would basically use fishing as their main way of supporting life here, and the different fishing villages would soon thrive. However, as any society in history would tell you, a surplus of food in a small land area leads to overcrowding on the islands. Curiously enough, though, nothing really changed until the early 1800s, nearly 10,000 years later, when the native Aleut tribe from far up north began to raid our island friends. What's interesting, though, is that on a map, the Aleut people live here, and the island tribes live here, so I don't know why they went down so far. Later in the same century, Spanish missionaries sent the natives off the islands and relocated them to missions in the west coast mainland. A century later, now that the natives were gone, the islands were now used for ranching and whaling, which I honestly didn't even know you could do in California. I mean, whaling isn't exactly their main thing. In modern times, the islands are used for nice, simple purposes under the U.S. government, like extreme bomb tests and Navy SEAL bases. The California Channel Islands also have a large ecosystem with all sorts of good stuff in it, like their own endemic species of pine trees, sea lions, foxes, and some sort of sheep too, which Wikipedia calls extremely rare. Boy, oh boy, do I love Chile. The place, not the food. Insular Chile refers to 2 sets of islands off the coast of Chile in the Pacific, shown here on this crude children's map I whipped up. I can't imagine I need to tell you who owns them. Let's zoom into the islands. Ah, there we are. The four main islands are pretty small too and have nutty names, but I promise you they're real. I'm talking Isla Robinson Crusoe. I'm talking Isla Alejandro Selkirk. I'm talking Isla de San Ambrosio. I'm talking Isla San Felix. The previous two collectively make up the Islas de Venturadas, but not the bottom two. They're their own thing, the Juan Fernandez Islands. Anyways, collectively they weigh in at around 41 square miles and have 900 people in total. Their de facto capital, or really just the main town here, is on Robinson Crusoe Island called San Juan Bautista. I haven't been entirely truthful though. Insular Chile includes two other tiny nowhere islands, Easter Island and Salas y Gomez. But everyone knows about Easter Island already, with the heads and stuff, and I don't really care about Salas y Gomez. Both island clusters were discovered in November of 1574, specifically the Desventuradas. Nothing really happened though. Seriously, these top two islands have little to no history. That's it. In the 1600s, the Juan Fernandez Islands were frequently raised by pirates who would sail to them and use them as a base for plundering and whatnot, mostly for pirate booty. Later on in the 1600s, the islands were also used as a penal colony for prisoners. Haha, learning from the best, I see. Oh, the Brits, always doing something. A while later, the sailor known as Alexander Selkirk was stranded on one of the islands. I'll let you guess which one. Did you guess Alexander Selkirk Island as mentioned before? Because you're wrong, it was actually Robinson Crusoe Island. By the time the 1800s rolled around, sailors decided to put the kibosh on being peaceful, and decided to do whatever horrific stuff people did to seals and whales back then. And that's basically it. They've been pretty uneventful since then. Animals here are also quite limited since they're a little too isolated for any Galapagos business to go down, which is a big disappointment. European ships brought over invasive goats, which, that ain't too fine. There's also a bird here called a tit tyrant, which just sounds goofy. They even have a Magellan penguin, whatever that is. Clipperton Island is an atoll who, is owned by France for whatever silly reason, though they call it Ile de la Passion. It's quite small, only at around 2.3 square miles in area, and nobody lives on it currently, but more on that later. It's located here in the red. You can't see it because it's so tiny, but it's situated in the center, if you're curious. They were discovered in 1528 by a Spanish explorer, Hernan Cortez, who was trying to find a quicker route to the Philippines, but accidentally ran into Clipperton instead. Not much happened with it until, basically, 1711 by the French, who kinda sorta rediscovered it, and they claimed it for themselves after some sailor from France spent a while living on the atoll. In the 1800s, the island's status was still questionable to say the least, forming the sort of unholy trinity between the US, Mexico, and France, all of whom were trying to claim the island. The US wanted to mine guano on it, and for Mexico wanted it just for whatever reason, and France wanted it because France. In 1907, guano was a big deal on the island. Remember when I brought it up 10 seconds ago? It's basically accumulated smelly bird poop in chunks that miners go crazy for. 7 years later, to help with construction efforts on the island, a mix of 100 or so men and women, and even a few kiddos of varying ages were sent to live here. As they worked and lived here, they would regularly receive shipments of necessary resources from the mainland via boat, and all was good. But one day, that boat stopped coming. This was likely due to the brutal Mexican Revolution that was going down, but alas, a marooning's a marooning. It quickly dissolved into chaos. 3 years later, the colony in 1917 was in a pretty bad shape, and out of everyone who was basically there, only 15 people survived, since everyone else died of scurvy. Out of them, only one man was alive, who made himself, quote-unquote, king of the island, and went on a huge rape and assaulting spree, which was finally ended after one of the islanders killed him in return. Later, they were rescued by an American ship who was sent to retrieve all of them. In recent history, many more shipwrecks and lost sailors ended up on the island, most of which ended in a successful castaway pickup, thankfully. The island doesn't have a lot of native plants or animals. Heck, even the palm trees on the island aren't native. They were brought over in the late 1800s. The atoll does have a lot of crabs and ducks, however. Not sure what you're gonna do with that. The Revillagigedo Islands, or as the IPA says, the Revillagigedo Islands, I didn't take Spanish, okay, I'm sorry, are a group of 3 tiny islands far off the west coast of Mexico, also owned by them. They have 61 square miles of land area and only have 45 people. We'll get to that in a jiffy. Here's the map if you want to know that bad of where they're at. I think you know what to do. The 3 islands left to right are Isla Clarion, Isla Socorro, and Isla San Benedicto. They were discovered in 1553 by the Spanish, who had a knack for finding small islands in the New World. Good on them. They found first Isla Socorro, but later made strides in finding Isla San Benedicto. All was normal until 1779 when Isla Clarion was found, but nothing came of it yet, so, there was that. All throughout the 1800s, multiple scientific studies were done, inspecting plants and animals on the island like a discount Charles Darwin. I feel like it went a little something like this. Needs less green. In 1861, the President of Mexico ordered the islands to be a penal colony of sorts, but this never got delivered on, for better or for worse. In 1957, our first people arrived with the founding of a Mexican naval base on Isla Socorro and a little something-something on Isla Clarion, which I couldn't find the details on, so at least we know where the 45 people come from. The islands used to have a lot more exotic and flourishing life because of their isolation, but a great deal of it was killed off instantly during volcanic eruptions in the mid-1800s. What's left is a husk of its former self, a shell of what once was. Mostly a lot of birds, to no one's surprise, and a lot of blubbery whales. Also, here's a rare treat, the whipsnake. Remember him? Well, allow me to jog your memory. Let's wind back to my first video, haha.
Now on to this goober, the California whipsnake. So while the California whipsnake isn't poisonous, it will mess your day up.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh god, I remember everything. Go back, I see demons, I see demons!
Europe.
The Faroe Islands are an archipelago owned by Denmark in a place where most people forget there's land. Its land area is nearly 540 square miles and it has a population of 48.5 thousand people, mostly centered around the de facto capital of the islands called Tórshavn. I don't know. It's here since I just know you're dying to take a peek as to where the islands are at. Yeah, I know, I'm cool like that. The first human settlers arrived around the year 300, who were likely the natives of the British Isles going north, or natives of Scandinavia going west. Everything was fine here until a few centuries later when suddenly Viking ships had actually come all the way east from Scandinavia, and also, what's even weirder, is that a lot of them were also from the neighboring British Isles, who would frequently come up to just raid the islands and do whatever, but most importantly set up a population center there. Now that this was all happening, this mostly took place during the 800s, and later, in that very same exact century, Norwegians who disagreed with some, Viking king guy, I didn't care to look into it that much, migrated in waves to the island, which gave the islands a big population boost. To basically, escape old Blondie or whoever he was, which I made that joke, but, self-explanatory. Around this time, the islands were also Christianized, just thought I'd throw that one in there. When the Kalmar Union was formed, it was a league of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, so the Faroe Islands were lumped into it as well, since, Norway. However, this only lasted until the 1500s, and during the schism, the islands ended up under Denmark's control instead of Norway. It remained mostly a Chile fishing village archipelago until 1856, when it unlocked its true fishing potential, when Denmark severely loosened its grip on the island's economy, allowing it to get more money from more services, effectively giving it more freedom to do as they please. After World War II, the islands would go through a lot of hard-fought independence movements, which eventually just wound up ending basically nowhere. Unfortunately, all good fishing must come to an end, because during the 1990s, the fishing industry on the islands collapsed, and the islands haven't been doing as well as they used to. Hey Bjork, what happened to the fish and the river? Yeah, Magnus, about that, I forgot to tell you. The islands have lots of unique wildlife that only lives on those islands due to their long-held isolation, and have a high population of rabbits, sheep, seals, and even orcas. God only knows what happened to those orcas back then. The Isles of Scilly, you know 'em well, don't ya? The British ones? They're here, southwest of Britain. Need to get up close? Boom! Tiny archipelago off the coast of Cornwall. They're 6 square miles and have a population of around 2,220 people in the de facto capital of Hewtown. So our obligatory history begins with the Phoenicians thousands and thousands of years ago, who are kind of the last people I would expect to be in this location. They went all the way up from the Middle East to essentially what's just a tiny island cluster in northern Europe. They frequently trade with the people there, mostly for what little tin they could scrounge up. It should be said that the islands may have actually been one connected larger island at some point, known as what's apparently dubbed Enwar. But while it's not definitively proven, there's lots of evidence to support the theory, like accountable and notable groups such as Cornish people a really long time ago, ancient Christians, and of course Gauls. Make of it what you will, but to me the evidence is certainly there. Due to their low elevation, however, water eventually flooded into the central plains of the Big Island and reclaimed much of the land, leaving us with what little islands we have now. In the 990s, Viking poobah Olaf Tryggvason regularly raided the Isles, but then, in an attack against him, he required immediate care. Thankfully, a Christian Scilly Islander showed him kindness and treated his wounds, with the end result being Olaf becoming a Christian himself. Around the 1300s and 1400s, the islanders began to ditch speaking the Cornish language in favor of English, likely due to England's rule over the Isles. In the 1650s, during the English Civil War, the Isles were in a tug-of-war between the two opposing sides, the Parliamentarians and the Royalists. Sometimes they were Parliamentarians, sometimes they were Royalists, you get it. That's mostly it for the history. The nature of the islands is surprisingly diverse, with them having hundreds of species of moths and butterflies, as well as dolphins and porpoises, not to mention the titular seal, and this weird little guy I found called a pipistrel. What a delightfully fun name. Guys, guess what? It's Åland, a webby mess of islands southwest of their owners, Finland. At 610 square miles, they sport 30,000 people, mostly focused around the de facto capital, Mariehamn. I'm not sure. There's an N after an M. I don't know how you do that. They're here, by the way. If you don't know where Finland is, look at a map of Europe. I believe in you. So the story begins around 7,000 years ago, when people really began to settle down here in this area, instead of just hunt wolverines or slay bears or whatever it is that Finnish people do. I don't know, I'm just some American, what do I know? These early settlers survived mostly on a diet of marine creatures like seals and fish and whatnot, and also learned how to farm. Now we have to jump, get this, 4,000 years, since nothing really changed in this time. We're skipping over the entirety of the Dark and Middle Ages, which is over 1,000 years in and of itself. The discovery of the New World, the American Wars for Independence, I'm talking everything. The plot thickens around 1854, however, so I should preface this by saying that around this time, the Russian Empire owned Finland and, in turn, Åland. So Russia was building some fortifications and barracks and whatnot on the islands, which violated some unspoken bond, which Britain was worried about since it would affect trade in the region. Russia was like, oh yeah, Taiho won junbi suru, and went to war. I mean, the Crimean War was already going on at the time, but potato. Eventually, Britain and France tag-teamed Russia, causing the Russian Empire's influence in the area to sort of die to death and made them demilitarize the island. In 1917, during the Russian Revolution, Åland was looking to Sweden for guidance, since Åland was always more Swedish culturally than Finnish. Finland forced Åland to stay a part of them and to hold Sweden, in layman's terms, to go do something else. During World War II, Åland's trading ships operated for both the Allies and Nazis for some reason. This is a good time to bring something up, by the way. If the Nazi flag comes up on the channel in the future, I'm not going to censor it, unlike many other channels. It's something from history and should be treated like it. It was absolutely a terrible and shameful time in history, but we need to look back to our mistakes and learn from it. This channel's about history. These things happened, unfortunately. Anyways, that's mostly it for the history part. I'm sure Åland doesn't look back on that time with pride, but you have to do what you have to do, especially during a world war. There's not a great variety of nature on the islands. In fact, the only real life here, other than the ample species of trees, is ducks and birds, which, I mean, I was really expecting it, because Northern Europe is full of a lot of stuff, so I was not expecting Åland to be like that.
Yes!
We did it! We finally completed the trilogy! Wow, this part isn't scripted. Usually my parts are scripted. I'm just speaking from the heart here. This took a long time to get done. I know the animations are kind of crude, but I mean, these 3 parts really took a lot out of me. I really worked my buns off trying to get this to come out at least semi-decent, and I'm actually pretty pleased with how the 3 parts came out. So I want to thank all of you who stuck around and watched them, and I want to give all of you a hearty thank you. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do next time. I'll find something. There's always more stuff to report on, and I'm going to say now, bye friends, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.